Which daughter will you take? The king asks the prince. I want the fat one. The court gasps. Candles flicker. Whispers rise like a storm. Everyone thought the prince would choose the younger, beautiful sister. Instead, he speaks words no one in the kingdom ever expected. A daughter long mocked, shamed, and hidden in the shadows suddenly finds herself at the center of the throne's gaze. But in this glittering palace, kindness is seen as weakness, and love is more dangerous than betrayal, because behind velvet curtains, a powerful father plots to destroy the match armed with lies, forged letters, and secrets meant to ruin her name forever. Will the prince's defiance hold when all of France laughs at his choice? Will the forgotten daughter finally claim her worth, or be crushed beneath the cruelty of her own blood? Is love strong enough to break a kingdom built on pride? Comment below, and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more The Great Hall of Versailles sparkle. In the glow of 1,000 beeswax candles, servants scurried about like mice, their feet silent on the polished marble floors as they made final preparations for the king's feast. The sweet scent of fresh flowers mingled with the rich aromas wafting from the kitchen-roasted pheasant, freshly baked bread, and delicate sauces that had taken hours to perfect. A young maid carefully straightened the enormous tapestries depicting great battles and royal triumphs, while others arranged silver platters and crystal goblets with practiced precision. The hall slowly filled with the rustle of silk gowns and the measured footsteps of courtiers taking their places according to rank and privilege. Duke Ivan guided his daughters to their assigned seats, his hand firmly pressed against Isabel's back as she glided forward with practiced grace. Behind them, Genevieve followed quietly, her eyes downcast. She knew her place, always a step behind her sister, always in the shadows. Remember your manners, Duke Ivan whispered sharply to Genevieve. Try not to eat too much. You embarrass? U.S. enough with your size. Genevieve's cheeks burned, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was her best shield. The magnificent oak chairs scraped against the floor as the assembly took their seats. Courtiers arranged themselves like pieces on a chessboard, dukes and duchesses nearest the royal family, lesser nobles further down, and the lowest-ranking guests relegated to the far end of the table. King Louis sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding attention without effort. To his right sat Prince Etienne, whose thoughtful eyes seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. The candlelight caught the gold threads in his embroidered jacket, but his expression remained serious, almost distant. When the first course was served, King Louis raised his crystal goblet. The hall fell silent, hundreds of eyes turning toward their monarch. My friends, he began, his voice carrying easily through the vast space. Tonight we gather not only to feast, but to settle a matter of great importance to the crown. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled nobles. The time has come to arrange a suitable marriage for my youngest son, Prince Etienne. A ripple of excitement passed through the gathering. Young ladies straightened their backs, while ambitious fathers leaned forward with barely concealed interest. Duke Ivan has graciously presented his daughters as potential matches. King Louis gestured toward where the Duke sat with Isabel and Genevieve. The Lady Isabel, whose beauty is praised throughout the court. Isabel lowered her eyes in false modesty, though her smile showed her pleasure at the recognition. Several courtiers nodded approvingly. She was indeed a vision in her pale blue silk gown, her golden hair arranged perfectly. And the Lady Genevieve? The king continued, his tone notably less enthusiastic. Whispers immediately filled the hall, barely concealed behind fans and hands. Genevieve felt their stares like physical touches, some pitying, others mocking. She heard the familiar words, the fat one, poor thing, what a shame. Duke Ivan's face remained carefully neutral, though his fingers tightened around his goblet. Everyone knew Genevieve was here merely as a formality. No one expected Prince Etienne to choose her over her stunning sister. The courtiers began their predictions in hushed voices, each certain they knew how this would play out. Surely he'll choose Isabel. A duchess whispered to her companion. Look at her. She's perfect for a prince. Prince Etienne rose slowly from his seat, and the hall grew silent once more. He stood straight and tall, his bearing every inch, that of royal blood. But when he spoke, his voice was calm and clear, carrying not command but conviction. I want the fat one. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Gasps erupted throughout the hall, followed by shocked murmurs and the sound of someone dropping. Genevieve's head dropped lower, certain she had misheard. She stared at her barely touched plate, her heart pounding so hard she feared everyone could hear it. She didn't dare look up, didn't dare hope that the prince's words meant what they seemed to mean. The hall remained frozen in that moment of collective shock, the candlelight flickering across faces filled with disbelief, while Prince Etienne stood unwavering, his choice made clear for all to hear. The feast resumed with an awkward clatter of silver against china. Servants moved between the tables, filling wine glasses with trembling hands, their eyes downcast to hide their own surprise at Prince Etienne's declaration at her place at the table. Isabel's smile had turned brittle as she fanned herself. With increasing urgency, surely there has been some misunderstanding, she whispered to no one in particular, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by those nearby. Genevieve sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The prince's words echoed in her mind, but she could not make sense of them. Was this some cruel jest? Her cheeks burned as she felt the weight of hundreds of questioning stares. Even the servants paused a moment too long when serving her, their curiosity barely concealed. Duke Ivan's face had turned an alarming shade of red. He pushed back his chair with a harsh scrape against the marble floor and strode toward the king's place at the head of the table. The whispers grew louder as he approached, then fell silent as he dropped into a deep bow. Your Majesty, Duke. Ivan's voice was strained with barely contained fury. I must protest this irregular choice. My daughter Isabel has been groomed since birth for such an alliance. She possesses all the qualities suited to a royal marriage: grace, beauty, proper breeding. King Louis raised his hand, and the Duke's words died in his throat. The king's face remained impassive, but his eyes held steel. You question my son's judgment, Duke Ivan? The king's voice was soft, yet it carried throughout the silent hall. Or perhaps you question my authority to approve his choice. No, your Majesty, the matter is settled. The king's tone left no room for argument. Prince Etienne has made his choice, and I find no fault in it. Lady Genevieve will be his bride. Duke Ivan's jaw worked silently for a moment before he bowed again, lower this time. As your Majesty wishes, he managed through clenched teeth. Before returning to his seat, the remainder of the feast passed in a blur for Genevieve. She barely tasted the elaborate dishes placed before her, aware only of the constant murmur of speculation that surrounded her like insects. When, at last, the gathering began to disperse, Genevieve fled to her chambers, her skirts rustling as she hurried through the torch-lit corridors. Her loyal maid, Madeleine, followed close behind. Inside her room, Genevieve sank onto a velvet-covered chair while Madeleine busied herself lighting candles. There, my lady, Madeleine said softly, coming to stand behind Genevieve's chair. Her weathered hands began gently unpinning Genevieve's elaborate hairstyle. You must not let them upset you so. How can I not? Genevieve's voice quavered. Did you hear them whispering? The fat one, they said. Even the prince called me. A knock at the door interrupted her words. Madeleine hurried to answer it, then dropped into a deep curtsy. Your Highness. Prince Etienne stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light from the corridor. Genevieve scrambled to her feet, her heart thundering in her chest. My lady, he said softly, remaining at a proper distance. I wish to speak with you, if I may. Genevieve could only nod, her throat too tight for words. I want you to know it was no mistake. His eyes met hers directly, gentle but unwavering. I see you, Genevieve, not as others do, but as you truly are. Before she could respond, he bowed slightly and withdrew, leaving Genevieve staring at the empty doorway. Later, after Madeleine had helped her prepare for bed, Genevieve knelt, beside her bed in her white nightgown. The stone floor was cold through the thin fabric, but she barely noticed. Outside her window, she could see the bobbing lights of torches as courtiers moved through the gardens, their voices carrying up to her room in fragments of gossip and speculation about the evening's events. Genevieve clasped her hands together, bowing her head over them. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice trembling in the darkness, "why would you allow such a choice? What could it mean?" A tear slipped down her cheek as she struggled to understand how her world had shifted so dramatically in a single evening. The torches continued their dance through the gardens below, casting moving shadows on her chamber walls, while Genevieve remained on her knees, seeking answers in prayer that she could not find in her heart. Dawn's first light crept through the heavy curtains of Duke Ivan's private chambers as he paced the length of his study, his face contorted with rage. Each step on the Persian carpet echoed his mounting fury over the previous night's humiliation. Unacceptable, he thundered, slamming his fist against the polished oak desk. To choose that embarrassment over my Isabel? I will not allow it. The Duke yanked on a velvet bell pull, and within moments, his secretary appeared. A thin man with ink-stained fingers who carried a leather writing case. "Sit," Duke Ivan commanded, gesturing to a small desk in the corner. "We have letters? To write many letters." He resumed his pacing, hands clasped behind his back. "To the Marquis de Beaumont first. He has the king's ear." The secretary's quills scratched against parchment as Duke Ivan dictated. "My dear Marquis, it pains me to write of such delicate matters, but duty compels me to share certain concerns. Regarding my eldest daughter's character, as morning progressed, the pile of sealed letters grew. Each contained carefully crafted insinuations about Genevieve, hints of improper behavior with servants, suggestions of unseemly appetites, whispers of unstable spirits. The Duke smiled grimly as he reviewed each one. "Let us see how the prince is. Choice appears once these reach the right hands." In another wing of the palace, sunlight streamed through tall windows into the ladies' sitting room, where Genevieve and Isabel sat with their embroidery frames. Isabel's needle flashed like a weapon as she worked, her movements sharp and aggressive. "I still cannot believe it," Isabel said, her voice dripping with disdain. "The prince actually chose you." She paused her stitching to examine her sister with critical eyes. "Though I suppose I understand now, it must be pity. What else could possibly explain such a choice?" Genevieve's fingers trembled slightly as she pushed her needle through the fabric, but she kept her eyes focused on the delicate flower pattern emerging beneath her hands. "Oh, yes," Isabel continued, warming to her theme. "How they will laugh. The prince and his charitable choice. I dare say you'll be quite famous, sister dear. The court will speak of nothing else for months." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a cruel whisper, though perhaps not in the way you might wish. Genevieve's throat tightened, but she remained silent, each stitch a small act of defiance against her sister's barbed words. Meanwhile, Prince Etienne had sought refuge in the palace gardens, walking among the carefully tended topiaries and marble fountains. The morning air was cool and fresh, offering a brief respite from the suffocating atmosphere of the court as he rounded a hedge. Voices carried from a nearby path. He paused, recognizing the distinctive laugh of the Comte de Renard. "Did you see Duke Ivan's face?" the Comte was saying, "when the prince chose that cow of a daughter? Priceless." "Perhaps his highness has developed unusual tastes," another voice replied, heavy with mockery. "Or maybe he simply closed his eyes and pointed." Laughter echoed through the garden. Etienne's hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening. He had expected ridicule, but hearing it so openly voiced made his blood boil. In that moment, he made a decision. He would defend Genevieve's honor before the entire court. That evening, as nobles gathered for supper in the grand dining hall, Etienne watched Genevieve enter quietly, her eyes downcast. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that suited her fair complexion, though she seemed to wish she could disappear into its folds. Servants filled the golden goblets with wine. Etienne rose to his feet. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the prince. "My lords and ladies," his clear voice rang out across the hall. "I wish to propose a toast." He lifted his goblet, his gaze finding Genevieve's startled face. "To Lady Genevieve, whose virtue and wisdom shine brighter than any jewel at court. May we all learn to see past surface impressions to recognize true worth." A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. Genevieve's cheeks flushed pink, but as her eyes met Etienne's, a small smile tugged at her lips. For the first time since the previous night's feast, a flicker of hope warmed her heart. The courtiers raised their glasses automatically, though many exchanged bewildered glances. In her seat, Genevieve felt something shift inside her, perhaps. Just perhaps. This was not the cruel joke she had feared. Morning dew still sparkled on the palace gardens when Prince Etienne made his way through the meticulously trimmed hedges. His eyes searched the winding paths until he spotted Lady Genevieve seated on a stone bench near the rose arbor, her loyal maid Madeline standing nearby. Taking a deep breath, he approached with measured steps. "Lady Genevieve," he called softly, causing her to look up from her book. "Might I join you for a turn about the gardens?" Genevieve's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded, rising gracefully. Madeline fell into step behind them at a respectful distance, close enough to observe, far enough to allow conversation. "I understand you play the harpsichord," Etienne said as they walked, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. "I do, Your Highness," Genevieve replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Though I fear I am not as accomplished as my sister. Please, when we are away from court, call me Etienne." He gestured toward a patch of white roses. "And I would very much like to hear you play someday. Music speaks truths that words cannot express. Don't you agree?" A gentle breeze stirred the leaves around them as Genevieve considered his words. "Yes, though sometimes I wonder if God gives us music to help us bear the burdens he places upon us." "An interesting thought," Etienne replied thoughtfully. "Do you find nobility to be such a burden?" "At times," she admitted, then quickly added, "though I should not complain of God's choices for my station. Why not? Even Christ questioned his Father in Gethsemane." Etienne's voice was kind. "Surely we lesser mortals may do the same." This drew a small smile from Genevieve, and for the first time, she looked directly into his eyes. From the kitchen gardens nearby, two servants paused in their work to observe the unlikely pair. "Would you look at that?" whispered one, nodding toward the prince and Lady Genevieve. "He actually offers her his arm, proper as you please." "I," replied the other, and not a hint of mockery in his manner. Unlike that snake Conti Renard, always making sport of her. The days that followed brought subtle changes to the rhythm of palace life. In the music room one afternoon, Genevieve's fingers danced across the harpsichord keys, bringing to life a gentle minuet. Etienne sat nearby, his eyes closed in appreciation. "Beautiful," he murmured when she finished. "You play with such feeling." Another day found them in the library, where Etienne read aloud from a volume of poetry while Genevieve worked on her embroidery. His voice gave life to verses speaking of honor, virtue, and the quiet strength of a steadfast heart. "Listen to this passage," he said, turning a page carefully. "True beauty lies not in the face alone, but in the soul that makes that beauty known." Genevieve's needle paused mid-stitch. "The poet is very kind." "The poet is very wise," Etienne corrected gently, earning a soft laugh from Genevieve that surprised them both with its warmth. Such moments accumulated like precious gems, shared smiles over tea, quiet conversations about faith and duty, the occasional brush of hands when passing a book. The court buzzed with gossip, but in these peaceful interludes, neither seemed to notice as dusk settled over Versailles one evening. Etienne and Genevieve found themselves in a quiet corner of the salon. Candles flickered in their silver holders, casting warm shadows across their faces. Madeline stood watchfully by the door, pretending not to notice when Etienne's hand briefly covered Genevieve's where it rested on the table. "You are braver." "Then you believe?" he whispered, his thumb brushing ever so slightly across her knuckles. Genevieve drew back as if burned, her cheeks flushing pink in the candlelight. She rose quickly, curtsied, and hurried from the room with Madeline close behind. That night, she lay in her bed, sleep eluding her despite the late hour. Her hand still tingled where he had touched it, and his words echoed in her mind. "Braver." "Then you believe?" She turned restlessly, her thoughts a whirl of hope and fear, until the first light of dawn began to creep through her windows. The midday sun streamed through Versailles. Tall windows as nobles gathered for the court assembly. Lady Genevieve entered the grand salon, her blue silk gown rustling softly as she moved toward an empty chair. Before she could sit, a group of ladies nearby began to whisper behind their painted fans. Goodness, one tittered loud enough to be heard. That chair seems rather narrow for such a substantial gown. Perhaps she should request 2 seats, another added with false concern, prompting barely concealed laughter from their circle. Genevieve's cheeks burned as she remained standing, pretending to adjust her fan while searching desperately for another place to sit. The mockery cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Each whispered word like a needle in her heart, thought Madeline, watching from her position along the wall with other servants, clenched her hands in silent fury. She could do nothing to defend her mistress. Without making the situation worse, when supper time approached, Genevieve lingered in her chambers, writing a note to excuse herself with claims of a headache. But before she could send it, a knock sounded at her door. Prince Etienne stood there, resplendent in blue and silver. "My lady," he said with a gentle smile, "I've come to escort you to supper." "Your Highness, I was feeling unwell." "Nonsense," he interrupted kindly, offering his arm. "The evening would be poorer without your presence." With trembling fingers, Genevieve accepted his arm. Together they walked to the dining hall, Etienne's head held high as he proudly led her to her seat. He even pulled out her chair himself, a gesture that sent fresh whispers rippling through the assembled nobles. "How common," muttered one duchess to her companion. "A prince serving as a footman?" But among the servants lining the walls, different whispers spread. "There's a true gentleman," one kitchen maid murmured to another. "Treating her with respect, he does." Later that evening, as Genevieve walked the servants' corridor on her way from the chapel, she heard crying. A young maid named Marie sat, huddled in an alcove, tears streaming down her face. "Child, what troubles you?" Genevieve asked, kneeling despite her fine dress. "Oh, my lady," Marie sobbed. "They say I stole Madame la Comtesse's silver bracelet, but I swear I didn't. They'll dismiss me without references." Genevieve frowned. "Tell me everything." Through careful questioning, she learned that another servant, jealous of Marie's recent promotion, had planted the bracelet in her apron pocket. The story stirred something in Genevieve's heart. She knew too well how it felt to be falsely judged. "Come with me," she said firmly, helping Marie to her feet. Together they went to the housekeeper's office, where Genevieve spoke on Marie's behalf. She insisted on a proper investigation, which revealed the truth through witness accounts. The guilty party was discovered and dismissed instead. Word of Genevieve's intervention spread quickly through the servants' quarters. "She stood there like a queen," one footman reported, "but spoke to Marie gentle as a mother. Didn't care about dirtying her fine dress, neither." "That's our future princess," another servant replied proudly. "Mark my words, she'll be a blessing to this household." But as Genevieve prepared for bed that night, voices drifted through her chamber door from the corridor outside. She recognized them as belonging to 2 noble ladies who often attended the queen. "It's an embarrassment to the crown," one said clearly. "She is completely unfit for a prince. Can you imagine her trying to represent the monarchy?" "Poor Etienne," the other replied. "Clearly his judgment has been addled by too much study and too little society." Genevieve sat heavily at her dressing table as Madeline brushed her hair. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks, dropping onto the lace of her nightdress. "Don't let them poison your heart, my lady," Madeline whispered fiercely. Genevieve wiped her eyes and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Despite the tears, a new strength showed in her face, a quiet dignity that hadn't been there before. Yet he has chosen me, she whispered, touching the place where Etienne had held her hand days before. The words felt like a prayer and a promise combined. Later, as she lay in her bed, tears still dampened her pillow, but they were no longer tears of shame. They were tears of someone beginning to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she was worthy of being chosen. After all, about the grand banquet hall of Versailles glowed with hundreds of beeswax candles, their light dancing off golden plates and crystal goblets. Weeks had passed since the prince's declaration, and while whispers still followed Lady Genevieve, they had softened somewhat. Tonight, she sat beside Prince Etienne, her dove-gray silk gown complementing his silver-trimmed coat. The feast progressed pleasantly until the court musicians began their evening performance. The first violin suddenly stopped playing, turning to glare at the second violinist. "You're rushing the tempo," he hissed, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "And you're dragging it." The second violinist retorted. The music deteriorated into discord before falling silent entirely. Uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the assembly as the musicians argued in harsh whispers. The king's expression darkened at this breach of decorum. Etienne leaned closer to Genevieve, his breath warm, against her ear. "My dear, perhaps you might rescue us from this awkward moment. I've heard you practice that new piece by Couperin." Genevieve's heart fluttered like a caged bird. "Your Highness, I couldn't possibly." "You can," he assured her, his eyes warm with encouragement. "Show them what true grace sounds like." Drawing a deep breath, Genevieve rose from her seat. Her knees trembled beneath her skirts as she made her way to the ornate harpsichord in the corner. The arguing musicians fell silent and all eyes turned to watch her progress. Settling onto the bench, Genevieve closed her eyes briefly, remembering her childhood music master's words, "Let the music flow from your heart, not your fears." Her fingers found their position on the keys. The first notes rang out clear and true, a sprightly dance tune that spoke of joy in summer afternoons. As she played, the tension in the room melted away. Her fingers danced across the keys with increasing confidence, weaving melody and harmony together like fine lace. From his throne-like chair, King Louis's stern expression softened. His head began to nod slightly in time with the music. Around the table, courtiers who had previously sneered at Genevieve now watched with genuine appreciation. The final notes hung in the air like perfume. For a moment, silence reigned, but this time it was a silence of pleasure rather than discomfort. Then applause erupted, led by the king himself. "Beautifully done, Lady Genevieve," the king pronounced. "We must hear you play more often." Color rose in Genevieve's cheeks as she curtsied deeply. As she returned to her seat, she noticed something different in the courtiers' eyes. For the first time, they looked at her with something approaching. Respect. Etienne helped her settle back into her chair, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than strictly proper. "Ici?" he murmured. "They begin to see what I saw from the start." He leaned closer, his voice for her ears alone. "It is your heart, not your figure, that makes you beautiful." Genevieve's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her thus, with such tender conviction. She wanted to respond, but words failed her. The feast concluded shortly after, and as the guests began to disperse, Genevieve found herself walking alone through the gallery of mirrors. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, creating silver pathways across the polished floor. She paused before one of the windows, studying her reflection in the glass. The moonlight softened her features, casting her face in gentle shadows. For the first time in years, she truly looked at herself, not with criticism or shame, but with growing wonder. Her fingers rose to touch the glass lightly, perhaps. She whispered, her voice barely disturbing the nighttime silence. "Perhaps I can be loved." The words hung in the air like a prayer, and in that moment, surrounded by moonlight and mirrors, Genevieve felt something shift inside her, as if a door long locked had finally begun to open. Duke Ivan paced his chambers like a caged animal, his fine boots wearing paths in the Persian carpet. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows, but they were not as dark as his thoughts. His plans to prevent the marriage of Prince Etienne to his elder daughter were failing. Something drastic needed to be done. "Bring me Marcel," he commanded a waiting servant, the one who works in the scriptorium. Minutes later, a thin man with ink-stained fingers appeared, bowing deeply. "Your Grace?" Duke Ivan's voice dropped to a whisper. "You have skill with a quill, do you not, and discretion?" "Indeed, Your Grace." Marcel's eyes darted nervously around the room. The Duke pressed a heavy purse of gold coins into the scribe's hands. "Then you will help me craft a letter, one that appears to be from years past, speaking of a peasant boy, one who caught my daughter's eye before we came to court." Marcel's fingers closed around the purse. "Which daughter, Your Grace?" "Genevieve, of course." The Duke's lip curled. "Make it convincing. Speaking of secret meetings, promises exchanged. Something that would make her unsuitable for a prince?" As Marcel worked at a desk in the corner, the Duke dictated phrases, carefully constructing a tale of forbidden love and broken vows. When finished, the letter looked aged, the ink slightly faded, as if it had been written several years earlier. "Excellent," the Duke murmured, examining the forgery. "Now, see that this finds its way to the king's private secretary, discreetly." The letter's effect was immediate and devastating. By midday, whispers echoed through every corridor of Versailles. Ladies hiding behind fans, gentlemen muttering in corners, servants spreading the tale with each dish they carried. "Did you hear? The fat one had a lover, a common peasant boy. Promises were made. How scandalous." The whispers grew louder with each passing hour. In the gardens, ladies who had begun to warm to Genevieve now turned their backs as she passed. In the galleries, gentlemen who had started to appreciate her wit now snickered behind their hands. Sunday arrived, bringing with it the weekly mass in the palace chapel. Genevieve entered wearing her best blue silk gown, her prayer book clutched tightly to her chest. As she approached her usual pew, the nobles already seated there suddenly found reasons to shift and move, leaving an empty space around her like a bubble of shame. From across the aisle, Isabel watched with gleaming eyes, her perfect lips curved in a triumphant smile. She leaned close to her companion, whispering something that made both women titter behind their fans. Genevieve felt each laugh, each sidelong glance, each whispered comment like physical blows. Her chest tightened until she could barely breathe. The priest's words blurred through her tears, and the incense that usually brought comfort now seemed to choke her as soon as the final blessing was given. Genevieve fled the chapel. She ran through the palace halls, no longer caring who saw her unseemly haste. In her chambers, she threw a few belongings into a small bag while her tears fell freely. "My lady, where will you go?" her maid Madeline asked, wringing her hands in distress. "To the Sisters of St. Clair," Genevieve whispered, drawing a black cloak around her shoulders. "Where Mother used to pray. They will give me sanctuary until... She could not finish the thought. Using the servants' passages to avoid being seen, Genevieve slipped out of the palace and into a waiting carriage. As the wheels clattered over cobblestones, she pressed, her face against the window, watching Versailles disappear behind her. Hours passed. The sun set, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. In the palace, Prince Etienne finally noticed Genevieve's absence from the evening meal. Concerned, he made his way to her chambers and knocked firmly on the door. No answer came. He knocked again, harder this time. "Lady Genevieve?" Still nothing. His knocking became pounding, worry evident in every strike of his fist against the wood. "Open this door at once." Finally, he tried the handle. The door swung open to reveal empty chambers, the contents of drawers. Scattered about as if someone had packed in haste. Madeline appeared in the doorway, curtsying deeply. "Your Highness, or is she?" Etienne demanded, his voice tight with concern. "She has gone to the Sisters of St. Clair, Your Highness," Madeline replied softly. Etienne's face hardened into lines of determination. His jaw set firmly as he processed this information, his eyes glinting with resolve in the candlelight. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the royal council chamber, catching dust motes in its golden beams. King Louis sat rigid on his ornate chair, his face a mask of controlled anger as he faced his youngest son. Around the massive oak table, counselors shuffled papers and cleared their throats nervously. "This letter speaks clearly," the king declared, holding up the damning document. The girl had a peasant lover. She made promises. The engagement must be annulled. Prince Etienne stood straight back before his father, his calm demeanor masking the storm within. "The letter is a lie, Your Majesty. I will not forsake her based on malicious rumors." "You risk everything?" Lord Beaumont, the eldest counselor, rose from his seat. His jeweled rings flashed as he gestured emphatically. "Your inheritance, your position at court, all could be lost over this common girl." "She is neither common nor dishonest," Etienne replied, his voice steady, but firm. "I will not abandon her to slander." The king's fingers drummed against the table's polished surface. "You defy me, then?" "I stand by my choice and my word." Etienne met his father's gaze without flinching, even if it cost me my rank. Whispers erupted around the chamber. Several counselors shook their heads in dismay, while others exchanged knowing smirks. Outside in the corridor, where servants pressed their ears to the door, the whispers were of a different kind. "God bless the prince," murmured a kitchen maid to her companion. "He stands up for what's right." "I'll light a candle for him at vespers," agreed a footman. "And for Lady Genevieve, too. Poor soul. Miles away at the convent of St. Clair." Morning prayers had just concluded. Genevieve remained kneeling in the small stone chapel, her head bowed. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns on the floor around her. Mother Abbess approached quietly, her dark robes rustling against the flagstones. "You have been here since dawn, my child." "I cannot return to court," Genevieve whispered, her hands clasped tightly. "The shame would destroy the prince's reputation. Better I stay here, among the sisters." Beatrice settled onto a wooden pew beside her. "And what of your heart's truth?" "My truth matters little against the weight of scandal." Tears slipped down Genevieve's cheeks. "I would rather live in God's house than bring dishonor to one who showed me kindness." "Perhaps the prince should decide that for himself," the abbess suggested gently. "No." Genevieve shook her head firmly. "I will take my vows and remain cloistered. It is better this way." Back at Versailles, Prince Etienne strode through the palace halls with purpose. Courtiers who had once sought his favor now turned aside, pretending fascination with tapestries or windows as he passed. Their whispered mockery followed in his wake. The fool prince, throwing away his birthright, bewitched by that fat girl's tricks. He'll regret choosing her over his duty. In his chambers, Etienne changed quickly into simple clothing, a merchant's attire without royal insignia or fine embroidery. His valet helped him pack a small trunk with equally plain garments. "Your Highness," the valet ventured carefully, "where shall I say you have gone?" "Say nothing," Etienne replied, checking that his sword was properly concealed beneath his traveling cloak. "I ride to uncover the truth of this letter, and I trust you to keep my destination private." The valet bowed deeply. "Of course, Your Highness. Godspeed your journey." As dawn's first light touched the eastern sky, a modest carriage rolled quietly through Versailles Servants' Gate. Inside, Etienne sat alone, his noble bearing hidden beneath common clothing. His jaw was set with determination as the carriage turned onto the road leading away from the palace. Behind him, the morning bell rang for early mass, its clear tones, carrying across manicured gardens where courtiers would soon gather to gossip. But Etienne paid it no mind. His thoughts were focused solely on proving Genevieve's innocence and exposing whoever had crafted such a cruel deception. After days of careful investigation, Prince Etienne found himself in the dimly lit servants' quarters of Duke Evan's estate. The autumn rain drummed against leaded windows as he confronted Thomas, a trembling servant who had been avoiding him for days. "Speak truth now," Etienne commanded, his voice firm but not unkind. "What do you know of the letter that slandered Lady Genevieve?" Thomas wrung his hands, glancing nervously at the door. "Your Highness, I cannot You can and you must. Etienne stepped closer, his expression resolute. An innocent woman's honor hangs in the balance. Hours passed as Etienne waited, letting the weight of conscience work upon the servant's heart. As evening shadows lengthened, Thomas finally broke down. "It was Duke Ivan's order, Your Highness," he confessed, tears streaming down his weathered face. "He made me forge the letter, claiming Lady Genevieve had pledged herself to a peasant boy. He gave me 10 gold pieces to copy her handwriting from her prayer book." Etienne's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Will you testify to this before the king?" "I will," Thomas whispered, "though it may cost me my position." "You shall have my protection," Etienne assured him. He summoned 2 trusted royal guards who had accompanied him in disguise, along with the estate's steward who had overheard everything. The return journey, too. Versailles took 2 full days through muddy roads and bitter weather. The first night, they sought shelter at the Red Lion Inn, where Etienne tossed restfully on a narrow bed, his mind filled with images of Genevieve alone in her convent cell. The innkeeper's wife, noting his distraction, placed an extra candle in his room. "For those who travel with troubled hearts, my lord," she said kindly. Though she knew not his true rank, dawn of the second day found them back on the road, their horses pushing through morning mist. By sunset, they reached Versailles, where Etienne immediately requested an audience with the king. The great hall buzzed with whispers as courtiers gathered, summoned to witness the unprecedented hearing. King Louis sat stern-faced upon his throne as Etienne presented his evidence. Thomas's testimony, the steward's account, and even the quill and ink Duke Ivan had provided for the forgery. Duke Ivan, forced to attend, grew pale as each witness spoke. His attempts at denial withered under the king's piercing gaze. "You have committed grave crimes against the crown," King Louis declared, his voice echoing through the hushed chamber. "Not only forgery, but an attempt to manipulate royal succession through false witness." The king rose, his figure imposing in the candlelight. "Duke Ivan, you are hereby stripped of all court privileges. Your estates shall be held in trust, and you are censured from my presence until such time as I deem fit for your return. Isabel, watching from the gallery, turned away in shame as her father was led from the hall. Courtiers who had once courted his favor now stepped back, leaving a clear path for his disgraceful exit, without pausing to accept the congratulations. Now freely offered, Etienne strode from the hall. He ordered a fresh carriage prepared, selecting his fastest horses. To the convent of St. Clair, he instructed the driver as the first light of dawn painted the sky in gentle pink. "Make haste." The carriage wheels clattered against cobblestones as they departed Versailles, racing toward the woman whose honor he had defended, whose heart he meant to reclaim. Morning dew glistened on the convent's roses as Genevieve tended the garden, her fingers gentle among the thorns. The sisters of St. Clair had welcomed her with kindness these past weeks, offering peace she had never known at court. Still, her heart ached with memories of what she had lost. The autumn air carried the scent of fresh-turned earth as she pruned withered blooms. Her plain gray dress, borrowed from the convent, felt oddly comforting after years of elaborate court fashions. Here, at least, no one whispered about her size or questioned her worth. The sudden creak of iron gates startled her. Footsteps echoed across the stone courtyard boots, not the soft whisper of nuns' slippers. Genevieve turned, her pruning shears dropping to the ground. Prince Etienne stood before her, his riding cloak dusty from travel. Without hesitation, he strode forward and knelt in the garden soil, heedless of his fine clothes. "My lady," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet cloister, "I have uncovered the truth of your father's treachery. The letter was false, your honor untarnished." Genevieve's hands trembled. "You need not bind yourself to me out of duty, your highness." "No duty brings me here," Etienne declared, taking her soil-stained hands in his. "I chose you before the world, and I choose you still before God." Tears spilled down Genevieve's cheeks as she whispered, "Yes." The mother abbess, watching from the cloister walkway, smiled and raised her hand in blessing. 3 days later. The royal chapel filled with morning light as the priest read the banns for the first time. I published the banns of marriage between His Royal Highness, Prince Etienne of France, and Lady Genevieve. The words echoed twice more over the following weeks, each proclamation making their union more real. On their wedding day, the chapel blazed with hundreds of beeswax candles. Genevieve stood before the great doors, her heart pounding beneath ivory silk. No longer did she hide behind others or shrink from view. The gown, specially made to honor her figure rather than disguise, it gleamed with silver thread and seed pearls. The doors swung wide. Organ music soared to the vaulted ceiling as Genevieve began her walk toward the altar. Courtiers who had once mocked her fell silent, their expressions shifting from disdain to wonder. Through the chapel windows came the joyous cheers of common folk gathered in the courtyards, celebrating a love that defied convention. Etienne waited at the altar, his smile radiant as Genevieve approached. When she reached his side, he took her hand without hesitation, his touch steady and sure. Together they knelt before the priest, heads bowed for blessing. But as the sacred words washed over them, Genevieve lifted her chin with newfound dignity. Her fingers entwined with Etienne's, she faced forward, finally understanding that true nobility had nothing to do with birth or beauty. Their union was proof that true nobility lies not in birth nor beauty, but in the courage to love. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here, where love speaks softly and stays.